network for these presidents to be a part of. And then on the other side, understanding how they were able to be connected to federal officials that did not know what to do about the race issue, or state level officials who did not know what to do about race in higher education. And these presidents, although their reputations as a collective, I mean, they're individuals that stand out, but their reputations as a collective aren't always on the forefront of our how we think about this group of leaders. Behind closed doors, navigating away from the spotlight, they were able to shape so many policies and practices that were so essential. I write about Martin Jenkins, who's the president of Morgan State College in Baltimore, actually testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee, right? We don't think about sort of Black college presidents on this federal level, shaping policy in that kind of way and challenging segregation and working to dismantle segregation. It's just a fascinating aspect of the story, and it really sets the tone for the rest of the book.
Yeah, and HBCUs are still doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of student outcomes in the United States. One of the, and then I would say the book shifts primarily and focuses on predominantly white institutions and the way they were engaging in this era. For me, one of the most disturbing chapters focuses on the University of Chicago, where the administration worked intentionally under the scenes to undermine housing desegregation near the campus, while at the same time making statements about institutional support for diversity. And I found it a really powerful example of systemic racism at work. Could you talk about this episode and its implications?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Look, the University of Chicago emphasis on housing discrimination and the role of that university, and not only that university, but I focus on individual decisions made by university leaders that make such a tremendous difference on this time frame. And so just to contextualize it for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book, if you think about sort of the Great Migration, Southerners, Black Southerners leaving and migrating to the Northeast or cities in the Midwest or even going out West, Chicago, as well as other major cities, have an influx of Black residents all of a sudden. But Chicago, again, like other major cities, is highly segregated. I mean, we're talking about racial restrictive covenants that go back to the 19 teens, if not earlier, coming through World War II. And what happens is the University of Chicago is located in Hyde Park. This particular neighborhood community is bordered by the Woodlawn community on the south and Washington Park on its west. And Woodlawn and Washington Park are predominantly Black. So as you get more people moving there and space gets tight in those neighborhoods, more Black people start to inch into Hyde Park, which means they get closer and closer to the University of Chicago. So in context of what we know about higher education history post-World War II, enrollments typically just skyrocket in growth. But the University of Chicago is actually struggling with this enrollment post-World War II. In fact, enrollment had hit an all-time low. Because of this, white faculty, white students, university officials were having a hard time keeping those people interested in attending the University of Chicago. It's one of those weird dynamics there where you talk about the university says one thing, right? It enrolls Black students, right? It has a number of famous Black students, alumni, Benjamin Mays, Carter G. Woodson, I mean, so many others that you can name that go to the University of Chicago, but at the same time, it doesn't want to be in too close a proximity to Blackness, right? And so what you see is university officials, Chancellor Lawrence Kiffin specifically in the mid-1950s, calls upon other university presidents in other major cities, including Harvard, MIT, Yale, Columbia, the University of Pennsylvania. These presidents meet and they come up with a plan for how to leverage funding from the Federal Housing Act that ultimately goes toward urban renewal, which is the informal program that just displaced thousands of Black households in cities across the United States. And you see, once again, the role of university presidents in shaping not only campus policies and practices, but federal policies. They go to Washington, D.C., they lobby before the Senate. They get funds earmarked at almost a $2 to $1 ratio, that if the university puts up $1, federal funds puts up $2, and we end up talking about millions of dollars here that ultimately go into universities being able to acquire property that once was where Black residents stayed near campus and had segregationist policies, and universities, higher education perpetuates that. I mean, at the highest level, it advances housing discrimination in cities across the United States. We're talking about from Seattle to Chicago to Philadelphia, New York. I mean, you think of a mid-sized to major city, and this happens because university leaders, white presidents and chancellors across the country get on board with this, largely under the leadership of the University of Chicago. So talk about just another instance to where we think about higher education having an impact far beyond the lives of students, but impacting the most basic tenet in the United States is being able to have a place to live and set up a home. And part of that is largely the way we think about even housing discrimination today. The remnants of those decisions from the 1950s are very much still with us.
Now, I remember you're telling me that you think there might even be a story involving the greater Princeton community that somebody will need to look into at some point. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. Spending so much time in the archives at Princeton, you know, the story of Princeton that I didn't focus on, which I wish I had more time to, and it's certainly a history that someone or several someones could explore. Is there something there also about urban renewal in Princeton, the Princeton township itself, especially when we think about the sort of the Jackson Witherspoon area, that relationship between the university, this is all correspondence that's coming through President Robert Goheen's office during this time frame as well. So that's not necessarily what I focus on specifically for Princeton, because I stepped back and looked at the major cities, but this does come down from Chicago, again, like I said, down to mid-sized cities like Louisville, Kentucky, but it also comes down to sort of smaller suburban communities as well when you think about a Princeton. And so there's certainly, this isn't just sort of this sort of abstract idea of the big city, the urban universities, if you will. This certainly also has implications for what happened in Princeton and its relationship to Black Princeton.
As President Eisgruber has described, one of the stories in the book is about Princeton and President Bob Goheen and his handling of free speech and inclusivity on campus, themes which are ripped from the headlines. So what lessons, first of all, I think the viewers would like to hear a little bit about that story, but then what lessons did you draw from it?
Yeah. So studying at Princeton, free speech really stands out as a racial issue. And let me explain a sort of backstory on that one as well. When you think about Robert Goheen and his presidency at Princeton, coming into the presidency in 1957, immediately, President Goheen emphasizes bringing a more diverse range of voices to campus, be it more conservative, be it liberal or moderate. I mean, a wide range of speakers come to campus during the early years of the Goheen presidency. And this ranges from everyone from Malcolm X to Martin Luther King to Fidel Castro. I mean, there's a pretty robust list of individuals that come to campus, but the one that stirred the most interest was when Ross Barnett, the segregationist governor of Mississippi, was invited to campus in October 1963. And for context, 1963 is a particularly violent year during the Black Freedom Movement. And events in Birmingham, Alabama, only few weeks earlier are really telling, because that's when the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed, killing 4 young Black girls, and 2 other youth were killed in Birmingham later on that same evening. That was a particularly violent weekend. So imagine Princeton University and Robert Goheen starting to actively consider recruiting Black students at the same time that Ross Barnett is invited to speak on campus by the Student Debate Society. You can imagine the conflict here all of a sudden, like, how are we going to be about further diversifying racially our campus while also bringing probably one of the most notable white supremacists to campus, because Ross Barnett had made himself really famous in a lot of ways in defying the Kennedy administration 1 year earlier when it came time to desegregate the University of Mississippi with James Meredith. And so that's the conflict at hand. And so one particular thing that stands out to me when you think about free speech, a lot of our history doesn't necessarily frame free speech as a racial issue. But that's one takeaway for me when I think about the episodes where Ross Barnett comes to Princeton, and that it is very much a racial issue. And for example, think about, what that says about your campus climate. When you think about a free speech takeaway, there was something about Princeton. And a lot of us probably know the history of Princeton. There was something about Princeton that made it particularly attractive to a Ross Barnett to say, that's the place I want to go and give this particular speech where he advocated for maintaining segregation. What did that say about Princeton at that time point? Because I always like to lay out this example. Ross Barnett, the state house, the governor's mansion in Mississippi, is in Jackson, Mississippi. He does not go give that same speech at Jackson State College, now Jackson State University, which is his historically Black college, a matter of just down the street from where he spends most of his time. You know why? You obviously know why, right? That sort of campus climate at Jackson State wouldn't welcome such a speech, but it did at Princeton. And that said a lot about Princeton and this long history to where, when you think about the Civil War, I mean, the enrollment was split, if you were to say, between, students from Confederate states and students from non-Confederate states at Princeton. And so there's a long legacy of alumni lineage at that point. And so when you think about what Robert Goheen does, is that, yes, Ross Barnett is welcome to campus in the sense of being able to give his speech. But Ross Barnett condemns the speech in a public statement, which is pretty common. We even could see that today, condemning a particular speaker.
You mean Bob Goheen condemns the statement?
Yes, Bob.
Yeah, sorry.
Robert Goheen condemns Ross Barnett coming to campus as far as giving the particular statement. I mean, condemns him giving his speech, but it is a moment to where Robert Goheen goes a step further and says, it's one thing to condemn hate speech or this sort of racist speech on campus. It's another thing to actually start implementing policies and practices on campus where such speech just doesn't have a place. And so Robert Goheen goes through a series of events immediately. I mean, a matter of weeks after Ross Barnett leaves campus, that actively works to create an atmosphere that not only welcomes more Black students, but also actively goes toward hiring more Black staff on campus, but also goes a step further in requiring companies that had a contract in construction with Princeton to have non-discrimination clauses and not discriminate in who they hire, as well as holding local landlords accountable for their discriminatory policies. And if they did discriminate on the basis of race, they were removed from Princeton University lists that were given to students on places that they could particularly rent. I mean, it was immediate just like that. And that's just another example of thinking about how that episode, this free speech-ish episode to where Ross Barnett comes to Princeton, Robert Goheen as president reacts actively to shape policies and practices that create such a meaningful atmosphere for Princeton. And in turn, you see an increase in the number of Black students on campus at post-1963.
Yeah, I think Bob Goheen is one of my great heroes in the story of Princeton. And I think underappreciated in some ways. He was a very humble man who deflected attention from himself. But that mix of both protecting free speech as a value and taking the action to make Princeton a more inclusive space is exactly what we struggle with every day. It's always about what's the right balance of those two things. It never gets easier, but the Goheen story is a really good example. Really good example.
Yeah.
So the final chapter of the book focuses on the early days of affirmative action programs, in which the predominantly white universities began to expand their outreach to Black students. But in doing so, they poached from and undermined Black colleges. So what should we take from this? Is that about unintended consequences, or is it more than that?
Oh, it's certainly more than that. It's absolutely more than that. When we think about affirmative action today, I really appreciate this question, because oftentimes today, when we look in the headlines and think of affirmative action, it revolves around questions of race and college admissions. And really what we're talking about is probably 2 or 3 dozen colleges and universities across the United States, in a landscape that has nearly 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States. affirmative action, the conversation really does revolve around the most highly selective, predominantly white institutions. And when we think about the history behind the original plans for affirmative action, that should give us pause, because really what we've done is we've accepted the most narrow conception of what affirmative action could be and should be when we're arguing over whether we can consider race and admissions. When in reality, in reaction to the John F. Kennedy administration and a direct request from the White House in 1963, college presidents on both the wealthier, predominantly white campuses, as well as a wide range of Black college campuses across the United States, started working together, because what the Kennedy administration requested was, could presidents help develop some, quote, special programs that will help address the nation's racial problems? Okay, that's the request. The Kennedy administration didn't say what special programs should look like. That was left up to university leaders themselves. And so, yes, a number of white institutions did actively start to recruit and enroll Black students and other students of color on the basis of race. Yes, that's one aspect, but the vast majority of the original plans focus on historically Black colleges. And really what you saw was presidents at University of Michigan or University of Wisconsin, or even Princeton with Bob Goheen and several others. They all came together, and for one brief moment, they understood that system-wide change was needed within all colleges and universities, right? This was a time to where we could imagine and fundamentally change the way we think about higher education in the United States. But in reality, what happened over time was interest in the particular Black college programs slowly went away. These programs were sort of summer institutes for Black college faculty to acquire graduate level degrees or advanced degrees beyond what they already had at white colleges during the summers. There were sort of these activist change programs. I think about the University of Michigan had a really robust one with Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. I mean, the number of programs were just quite impressive, really, when you think about reacting to the pressure of the Black freedom movement, and higher education really was there. But like you said, and undermining those programs is really telling, as soon attention by a number of presidents and chancellors at predominantly white institutions soon leaned toward media attention and actively seeking publicity for their racial efforts, as opposed to continue to work towards system-wide change. And so that's why a lot of the partnerships with the historically Black colleges during the 1960s soon fell apart, and all of the attention quickly went to there became a better photo op when there were a few Black students studying on a predominantly white campus, as opposed to actively doing the work to invest in, say, a few thousand Black students who were already enrolled at several Black colleges in the United States. And so again, it really invites us to say we had an opportunity during a moment of tremendous change in the United States that reminds me so much of us right now in 2020, and makes me think about what we just saw when a number of corporations and universities issued statements that actually said Black Lives Matter. Again, it feels eerily similar to what we've seen in the past. And there's so many lessons to understand that it really takes a sustained interest in Black lives. It's not just a matter of this one-time statement and this sort of publicity-facing effort.
Yeah, I think there is nothing stopping us now from exactly the kind of partnerships with HBCUs or other predominantly Black or minority serving institutions that any more than it was stopping us then. I think our very narrow definitions, really court-based definitions, but based on affirmative action cases in the Supreme Court, have kind of got in the way somehow of our ability to perceive this as the opportunity that it is. At Princeton, we are in the early days of thinking a lot about what our stronger relationships with HBCUs and MSIs, minority serving institutions, should be, with an awareness that we really have to get it right. This is about figuring out what truly reciprocal, sustained partnerships would look like. So we're thinking carefully about that. But there is nothing that prevents that opportunity from being as valid now as it was then, as far as I can see.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, Michele. And it's one of those things where you think about this if we're going to address, ongoing decades long issues of race and discrimination, then it's going to take an ongoing decades long effort to overcome those issues, right? We can't just sort of have a 2020 moment and just say we're behind it. Let's buy some books and, have some certain people come to campus and we've done our effort. This is going to take us just as serious in this conversation as we are right now in 2021, as we're going to have to be in 2031 and 2041. Right? This is going to have to be ongoing and ongoing, because you can't overcome a couple hundred years of, embedded, I mean, racism in how our institutions have functioned, and then just say we're going to come up with a couple programs in a couple of years. So you're right. I mean, it's going to take some long, deep thinking about what it takes, but there was nothing stopping them in the 1960s. There's certainly nothing stopping us right now.
Yeah, and I don't want us to miss this opportunity. And it is generational. It is generational. We're going to go in a moment to questions from the audience. So if you have questions, audience members, you can start to type them into the chat function, and then we'll relay those questions to Dr. Cole. But first, Eddie, a final question for you, and this really goes to this generational challenge. Based on your research, what would you advise college presidents who are trying to navigate conflicts over race and build anti-racist institutions? And second part of the question, what would you advise student activists who are trying to understand how to work with and influences their colleges and universities?
Those are two great questions. And I thought pretty deeply about this as I reflect on the book and have more and more book conversations. One thing I tell current college presidents is, just like you have an ongoing standing meeting with, say, your vice president for finance or dean of students, your cabinet, if you will, you should have a reoccurring ongoing meeting with your university archivist. I mean, it should be a standing meeting on your calendar. It's like, you know what? 2 weeks have passed already. It's time for me to go back to the archives. Because it's one thing to know your institutional history. It's another thing to know the social history of your institution. And that's so essential for university leaders today, because what we see in history is those presidents who are most effective in creating policies and practices that truly had racial advancement were the presidents that exhibited an understanding of people. The social history of your university is so important to understanding the people's history of your university, because day in and day out, week in and week out, it's people who make your university work. That's it. It's not just sort of high level, this idea of Princeton, for example, or this idea of UCLA, for example. It's the individual people who come to work every day that make it happen. And so you're better served at leading those people when you understand the ongoing histories and challenges that have been before those people. And so that's something that any college president, I really appreciated the introduction to our conversation today, because I love when the president says that they've learned something about their own institution in reading this book, or it made them really reflect on their job when reading this book. I hear that so often, and it's really gratifying for me, thinking as someone who studies this history, but also it really encourages leaders to sort of continue to learn more and more about the university, and not only just the university itself, but learn more and more about the office that they occupy right now. I mean, there's such a richness in the archives right there at Princeton University about the office of the president. And you can see sort of the many paths that some decisions could have gone when you really study that history. So it's certainly something important to learning that social history. And then if you want to go a step further and be sort of a phenomenal president, you sort of step away from your campus, get into your local historical society, right? Imagine, right, going across Nassau and going down to Jackson Witherspoon, right, and understanding sort of what are the records that are kept right there in the community, and what does that community say about your university, right? What does New Jersey say about your university? Go down to Trenton. What is the reputation? I write about this in the book. There's a certain perception of Trenton residents of what's happening in Princeton, right? That's so insightful. So if you really, just as much as you got a connection to alumni and finances, you should also have this rich connection to history, because then you can really speak at a much more compelling level when it comes to leading the institution. So that's my advice for college presidents. Now, my advice for student activists who really want to engage presidents and create change on campus and actually see that change coming to fruition. I was just talking to a group of students that had made demands and grievances on their respective campus. And one thing that I told them was that you've got to have a system at place to where you can pass on from academic generation to academic generation what the demands are and where the issues stand upon this group graduating and this next group coming in. Imagine if you had an informal orientation among students that was like, you know what, when we were juniors, we were dealing with this. You're a freshman now. I'm turning my attention toward graduation, but this still hasn't been addressed completely. It may not happen during my time as a student, but we would still want to see it happen. And here's where the conversation has left off. There's really some richness. I mean, I don't care if you do it electronically or over Zoom or whatever. There's so many ways that you can ensure that movements progress and change happens on college campuses when you can keep the pressure on administrators ongoing from class to class. Because when I think about how I even was thinking, going into the archives, thinking about writing this book in 2015, and then fast forward now to 2021, when I look at some of the demands, they're really similar, right? This is a different group of students, but the demands are very much the same. And when I was in the archives at one particular university, I came across student demands from the late 60s, 1993, and 2015. If you sort of change the language with a word or two here and there and take the date off, you might have a hard time determining which era created those demands. And that says a lot, though, about how universities have been slow to change, how university officials have sort of oftentimes sort of been around in their positions longer than a particular class. And so you see some progress, but then another issue comes up and administration turns that way. And so that's one thing that, again, that I would advise contemporary student activists is that think about a system that's best suited for your campus for how to pass information on from academic generation to academic generation.
Yeah, I think part of what is very hard for students often to process is how sustained the process is going to have to be, how disciplined it will be over the course of a generation. And that does require passing down knowledge. It creates a role for alumni as being the carriers of that history. So alumni become a very important part as well of helping advise students, both about what has happened, but also about the discipline that's required to sort of stay with it and be realistic about how fast change happens. And then every generation of student activists is relearning the same basic skills of how do you work with the administration? How does this administration organize things? How do we get things done? That's a real challenge. I also think that college presidents, no college president comes into office thinking that what they're going to do is deal with anti-racist student activism. That's not what they're trained for. I think this generation of college presidents has had to learn a lot of that on the job. And this book has a lot of good examples in it and a few bad examples, but a lot of good examples.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, again, that's well said. Absolutely. I mean, there's so much to pick up from this book, even occasionally just sort of in these conversations. I just really appreciate hearing administrators reflect on it just as much as I hear from activists reflect on it as well.
Well, we administrators definitely have a lot of work to do. We are a work in progress and our institutions are a work in progress. So I will start to go to some questions from the audience and keep putting those questions in the chat. So here's the first one. How do you think future historians will tell the story of the last year or so in American higher education? What can young higher ed professionals and historians do now to help shape that history toward one that is more inclusive and anti-racist?
Wow. What would future historians say about us today? Wow, that's a that's a big question. I'm hopeful future historians will be able to demonstrate some progress. We'll be able to sort of make some if you think about the long history of racism within U.S. higher education. Hopefully there's something about progress. But, my hope is that, future historians um, continue the pursuit of truth and continue to hold universities accountable. It's just sort of really digging into the richness. And what I would hope future historians would do who study in higher education history is sort of the future looking back on our present is really sort of bring in a variety of voices into their history. When you're doing your archival research or doing oral history interviews or whatever it may be for their approach, there's something to be said about doing this kind of work and not relying solely on the university perspective or the university's records. That's one thing that's going to be absolutely essential, because the university has always had this real established public relations arm, if you will, that has a strong narrative about what the university is. Even in its darkest episodes, universities have taken the time to sort of finesse and polish the university and its values alongside its dark histories. So historians would need to always want to talk with activists and community members and alumni and a variety of student voices, as well as administrators when telling the history of this moment. So that'd be one thing that's absolutely essential, because even in my work with the book in front of you, it did not rely solely on university archives. I mean, I've spent as much time trying to walk across Nassau, for instance, when I was in Princeton, right, to engage the community and get down by the public library as much as I did campus facilities. So that's one thing. And then as far as what can historians do today, or future historians do today, or higher educational professionals do today, it's going to be about record keeping. Those two things are related to each other. I mean, document this moment. Do consider ways that you can preserve decisions made, and consider filing them with your respective university archive. Because what's going to happen is someone like myself, a future version of myself, will come along very much interested in how did we handle 2020, 2021 academic year, where we saw so much racial uncertainty, but as well as we saw a global pandemic that was racialized in its implications as well. And so what does it even mean for higher education to function in this moment? And some historians are going to come along in the future trying to figure that out. And hopefully we would have left enough sort of breadcrumbs, if you will, to piece it together.
One of the things that Princeton's archives has done very well is to try and gather the records of some of the student activist movements, including all of these digital records, because these aren't memos as they were in Bob Goheen's era. They're in completely different forms. And so it becomes really important to be trying to figure out how to capture that material. So here's another question. It says, the issue is far reaching. Do you think it's worth the time to step back and look at public school funding inequities? In other words, one finding, let me see if I'm reading this correctly. So for example, majority local property taxes, so a range of way more complicated systemic issues. Could this prepare more public school students of color for an Ivy League education? And I will add to that, should our goal be just to get more students into the Ivy League, or as we've talked about with HBCUs, are there other goals? So looking back at public school funding inequities, underlying systemic issues, preparing students of color for the Ivy League.
Yeah. Should we step back? Absolutely. You have to look at, particularly for public universities, you have to look at the dwindling amount of state funding that's been earmarked for universities. I mean, there are some public universities, when you look at their state allocation, it is down to about single digits. A single digit percentage of their budget comes from the state. So in so many ways, a lot of public universities are public in name only. In reality, they're relying on a number of other sources just to execute the academic mission of those institutions. And that is worth stepping back and looking at, because what it does is put a number of administrators in position to sort of find the funds elsewhere. And a lot of those elsewheres end up being private entities, private funds. And what does it mean to sort of develop a public institution that relies so much on private funding in the interest, perhaps, of who those individuals are, or corporations or companies may be, that are giving said private funding to the university, right? We can just go down the line on sort of the conflicts at hand with that, politically, financially, and the list goes on. So I do think that's going to be warranted when we think about looking at this moment in the future. Another thing to think about as sort of as to the second half of the question, or thinking about is it, to recruit more students of color to the Ivy League? I don't think that's necessarily the goal, or that should be the goal. I think if students of color are interested in the Ivy League university, yes, recruit them. But I also think if students of color want to be closer to home, right? I know the questions mentioned Ivy League universities specifically, which are sort of geographically located in the Northeast. So what does that mean for the other sort of 90% sort of of the country from a geographic standpoint? You got to understand the cultural connection to so many families of color, and what does it mean to be near home and to have these sort of multi-generational families in the same space with each other. So for myself, as someone who grew up in Alabama, I mean, going as far away as New Jersey or New York certainly wasn't nearly as appealing to me for my undergraduate studies. So I don't think it's necessarily just saying students of color as a group need to have more opportunities at Ivy League institutions. I'm gonna go back to what the original plans for affirmative action were in the 1960s and say, what we need to think about is ways that the wealthier institutions can have a different understanding of how they distribute resources and understanding and support to have a more widespread change in US higher education, to where more institutions can offer similar opportunities as those that are bestowed upon students enrolled at Ivy League universities.
And I think you would agree that we need the funding of K-12 education to be more equitable so that all of our students, including Black students, are well prepared, and then they can make the choices about what institution suits them. But that if they can go to an Ivy League school, they can go to a state school, they can go to an HBCU, they can go wherever they want because they're well prepared. And that's really what we're missing a little bit in our system right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the funding disparities in K-12 education, it certainly starts early. I mean, we're talking about, it's just so complicated. I mean, so talk about when you talk about those studies that look at percentage of students from certain neighborhoods that can go on and pursue education at certain levels, that's all tied to just how we structured our funding of K-12 education.
Right, systemic issues. So here's a question. Could you speak to how students and alumni can archive their materials and records? Do you have advice?
Yeah. That's a great one. One, if I'm assuming if you're willing to put in the effort, there's one thing to digitize everything, right? So I mean, you can take a photo of it, you can PDF things, get it into a digitized format, because as we see right now in this sort of virtual learning experience that so many of us are in, it's great to be able to share materials in electronic format as opposed to physically going to the archive. So that's one thing. If you want to take on that effort, I've got thousands of photos from when I went to the archives, because I could have photocopied it and had a physical copy, but it's also nice to have a digital copy as well. So that's one thing. Think about sort of what does an electronic archive, personal archive looks like for you. And then the second thing is seriously think about building a relationship with your respective either local historical society and or your local university, and or if you're an alumni, your respective alma mater, to where you can sort of leave your records to them. I don't know just yet at this moment of any university archivist that's turning down records of alums of materials that were created not only while they were students, but really materials that came about even after they graduated and went on into their lives and their careers after undergraduate. And so from that standpoint, I think that gives us such a richness to where we can have this record kept in sort of a formalized place that's controlled and structured and has a system for keeping those records. I think that's so exciting. It's one thing that even right now, as I teach undergraduate students virtually here at UCLA, in my history of higher education class, I tell them think about your student organizations that you're in right now, and think about what you're going to do with those documents even as you get ready to graduate. There's you should consider either again leaving them to the university, because again it gives you an active role in making sure that your voice, your contributions, your perspectives are on record with the university, as opposed to taking them with you.
Right, right. So as you've traveled around, Eddie, you're traveling virtually, I guess, these days. What do you find is drawing people to this book? Are they being drawn? Are there specific stories or specific themes that are particularly intriguing or unsettling for people?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that draws people to this book is that their interest in understanding society at large. It is a higher education history, but in so many ways, it's a history of us as the United States. And people have really found so much interest in that these sort of high level issues that we're still dealing with today: free speech, housing discrimination, affirmative action, the role of historically Black colleges, who gets access to what colleges. I mean, these are questions that we're asking right now today. And as people pick up the book and start reading it, they've really come to appreciate things about their own lives that they hadn't thought necessarily as much about, much less the role of their respective alma maters or their local universities in perpetuating or challenging those same issues that we're dealing with today. And so that's one particular thing that sort of gets people coming in, because you see the campus color line and you think, oh, okay, this is maybe a history of race on college campuses. But once you start reading it, you all of a sudden say, oh no, this is national in scope. This isn't necessarily a regional history. It's about the Black freedom movement, but it's not centrally located exclusively in the US South. So all of a sudden, from coast to coast, regardless of region, a lot of people are starting to see a lot of similarities in their own lives and issues that they're concerned with, particularly in 2020, that really captures their attention with the book. And one issue that stands out almost universally is housing, and how federal housing policy being deeply linked to institution of higher education. And what does it mean when you think about the generations of Black people that have lost long-time homes that their families owned in the 1930s and 40s and 50s in major US cities, that no longer have that property in their family? That says a lot about how we think about the distribution of wealth across racial lines in the United States, and how people have had so many challenges in the inability to accumulate wealth over generations, largely because of higher education.
This next question, I think, really builds right on that. And this is a big theme question. It reads, ongoing racism makes me feel pessimistic about change. What does hope look like? So what's making you hopeful in all of this, Eddie?
Yeah, yeah. The book also has some stories of hope. And the book, in a way of thinking about the ongoing challenges of racism, what leaves me hopeful is that because I focus on individuals and decisions made by individuals, it gives me hope that somewhere along the way, these individuals in position of power and influence can make decisions that are for the better, right? It's not one of these things where it's exclusively a matter of, the institutions have to change per se. There's a lot to be said about leadership. These university administrators have a tremendous amount of influence. They had it historically, they still do. And that was sort of insightful for me too, going into writing the book, because when federal officials or corporate leaders or other entities don't know what to do about particular problems, they tend to look toward colleges and universities, because colleges and universities are expected to have people who can figure out how to solve complex problems. And so in turn, college presidents and chancellors are oftentimes called because they lead the institutions that are expected to help us solve complex problems. Therefore, I'm pretty hopeful when you think about the more college presidents, the more current administrators pick up a copy of this book and pause and reflect on their work, and not only their work, but their influence and their responsibility in making racial issues a high priority for them. It does give me hope, because who's getting a call right now from, say, the Biden administration? A lot of people affiliated with universities. right? A lot of people who have this sort of academic connections. And so our work here was hopeful is more people within academia are starting to think deeply about their role and responsibility in challenging racist systems and creating policies and practices that make a more inclusive, not only campus, but society at large.
I feel like you just named my task, not just my task, everyone at Princeton's task, but that is what we have to do. That's our responsibility. So I'm going to do my best to keep owning it. Do you have a next project? Where will you go next?
There's some richness. There's so much higher education history that remains to be studied. One particular thing that this book is focused on the post-World War II era through the 1960s. But again, where I start this book, these issues weren't new then in the 1940s. And so I do think there's similar questions being asked of universities across a longer time period. Will be really enriching, and it's really encouraging for me to see so many universities, particularly on the Eastern Seaboard, thinking deeply about their relationship to the institution of slavery. Phenomenal historians are doing that work and have been doing that work. And I look forward to seeing the connections, the longer histories of universities that go from even the sort of the colonial college era through the 1960s and 1970s that show that from not only decade to decade, but century to century, there's much more to be understood about the role of colleges and universities in shaping race and racial understanding in the United States. And so I think I'll, continue to explore ideas and topics in that direction without saying too much specifically about what I'm thinking.
Mhm, mhm. One of our treasures at Princeton is Professor Marnie Sandweiss, who has led the project on Princeton and slavery, which has been a really good example of that type of work, and one that was, I think, a really eye-opening experience for Princeton. And now that work is extending into the antebellum period and into the early 20th century, or from the antebellum period into the early 20th century. I just want to tell viewers, if they haven't been to the Princeton and Slavery website, they should go check it out. It's a very good example of what Professor Cole is talking about. So here's another actually quite related question. Who are the historians and scholars that you're reading? What is interesting to you right now that you would recommend to others?
Oh yeah, that's a great. I mean, there's books everywhere behind me. I don't know where do you grab first? So a couple of things that come to mind, and someone that I really enjoyed watching recently is Dr. Jelani Favors, who has a phenomenal book on the history of HBCU activism and the relationship between HBCUs and fostering activism, multiple generations of activism, really going back to the 1800s and working through the 1970s. So as we think about Black students today, even beyond HBCU campuses, that's one particular history that stands out to me that's really interesting. Another one, let me just add, is Stephen Bradley, who's a historian who wrote a book maybe 2 or 3 years ago now called Upending the Ivory Tower. And actually, this would be interesting to many of you listening. It's a history of Black student activism at Ivy League campuses, going to each Ivy League campus and talking to a range of Black activists, going through the Black Power movement. So that's just a phenomenal piece of work. And he lays it out nicely and how we think about Black student activists, but we don't necessarily think about them in sort of Ivy League institutions historically. And so that's a phenomenal piece of work. And then I also want to sort of give a head nod to some work in progress. Historian Crystal Sanders at Penn State right now, who's doing a history really of understanding Black students and their pursuit of higher education, particularly graduate level higher education, and sort of the out-of-state aid programs that Southern states had, that instead of desegregating their respective universities, they actually funded a number of Black students to go to other universities that were desegregated. That history makes a lot of appearances in other histories, but I look forward to her complete work on it, and had a really interesting op-ed in the Washington Post a few weeks ago on that topic. And I could start naming people and going on and on and on, more and more books. But those three particular historians of higher education really stand out to me right now.
Mhm. A question. What drew you to becoming a faculty member? If you weren't a professor, what would you be doing?
Wow,
I
what a
love that question.
Uh, well, one thing for me, what drew me to being a faculty member was, in full transparency, I'm from a family of educators, to be clear. I write about this in the preface of the book, but I grew up in West Central Alabama, growing up in Greene County specifically. My grandparents on my father's side were school teachers in the Jim Crow South. Imagine them starting their careers in a one-room or two-room schoolhouses. Those were my grandparents. And then my parents actually went on and had similar careers also in West Central Alabama, rural West Alabama, teaching careers respectively, more than 30 years each for both of them. And so part of me always understood the power of teaching, but also knowing that my family went into education starting their careers in the segregated South. And there's this relationship between their work and understanding the role of education in Black liberation. I always saw myself in a lot of ways, sort of in this more instructor kind of facing role. I don't know if I saw myself as a professor per se, but I always loved the opportunity to cultivate and sort of lead in a way other people. And so, who knew, as I continued through schools, like who knew this faculty thing actually existed? And so part of my work, part of my interest and how I've come into this own role is really sort of family lineage, like a lot of people are, and understanding the role of not only educators in general, but the role of a Black educator in supporting students and making them be a part and have a much more liberation-centered educational experience. So that's one thing. And then what else would I be doing? If not a professor, this is for, I guess, the whole world to see, live stream. But, part of me did once briefly think of myself as sort of a sports broadcaster, being an anchor on an ESPN or a Sports Center, something like that. That dream did not last too long, but I do enjoy sports as well. So maybe I'll be doing that. I don't know. You have to tell me, whoever answered that question. Send me an email and let me know after watching this. How do you see me as a sports broadcaster?
I think you've got a knack for like looking right into that camera, and I think you might have a future. At least you get to live that out through Zoom experiences.
Maybe, perhaps. Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, we'll see.
So I think we have time maybe for one or two more questions. Uh, you just made a reference to yourself teaching, and I wonder if you would talk for a moment or reflect on the role of Black faculty members and the experience of Black faculty members, particularly on predominantly white campuses, which is, well, I'm not going to characterize it. I'm just going to ask you that question. What would you comment on?
Yeah. No, that's such a heavy question, and is a question that, in some way, I think I reflect on every day. When I even in this virtual world, probably perhaps more so in this virtual space, I think about my role in being able to connect to students and make students really see, in so many ways, a lot of themselves in me. I had a student this actual quarter, because we're on quarter system at UCLA. I had a student this quarter actually sort of hang around on Zoom after class and just say, I haven't had a lot of Black faculty before. And I just wanted to say it's really cool to see you. And I'm excited about this class because of that. That's you can't script that. You can't make somebody say that. And that's really that's both heartening in one way personally, but it also is disheartening because to this one particular student, immediately I've taken on this sort of additional weight in supporting, and it's what several of us do. I mean, so many not only Black faculty, but so many faculty of color take on a responsibility beyond who their official advisees are, beyond who their official doctoral students are, and they find themselves mentoring and advising and simply cheering from the sideline for a number of students. So I don't take my responsibility lightly at all. If anything, it's a very serious, heavy amount of work to be present for students day in and day out, term after term. But it's so encouraging. And really, you get this one moment where you get to sort of stop and see them at graduation and say the years of support was worth it. And that's sort of how I think about it. Something I used to always joke about looking at my parents being teachers was so many other students call them mama this or dad that, right? And as the actual son of my parents, I always wonder like, hey, no, that's my mom, right? But as I've come into this career, I have a much deeper appreciation to what my parents were doing, not necessarily at a UCLA or Princeton, but what they were doing in West Central Alabama was just as transformative as anything I can imagine that I'm doing right now. And so that's how I think about my work. What a great question. What a great personal question. Thank you for that.
This is why we need more Black faculty members and more faculty members of color, because students crave the relationships and the role models, but also because of exactly what you're describing that you bring to it, which is a level of personal commitment in terms of support that's just so impressive. So we are out of time.
Already, wow.
It's gone really, really fast. It's just amazing. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to say, first of all, to our viewers today, I hope that this experience has inspired you to want to go deeper. There is so much rich content in this book, so you should get a hold of this book. And I want to invite you to explore Princeton's history as well. We have a History and Sense of Place website where you can find all kinds of materials, and maybe eventually you'll be able to find a recording of this. I can see Chris Eisgruber back on my screen. Did you want to comment further, Chris?
I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Eddie Cole for such a wonderful and enlightening presentation, and to say how glad I am that you are a historian and a scholar rather than a sportscaster. You might be great at that, but we're fortunate to have you doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
So thank you all for our viewers for being with us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Happy reading.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Be safe.